Hey, Matt,
What?
I think it's time.
Time for what, Dennis?
It's time to talk about evil.
Ooh. I think we need I think we need something though.
Do you know do you know of anybody who can help us talk about evil?
In fact, well, as a matter of fact, I do. We have a problem of evil expert right here. Yeah.
Oh,
Wow, hey.
hey, I just took off my one ring and now I'm here. I've appeared.
Wow,
Boom. Hi.
impressive. Is that witchcraft? Is that evil? Is that what we're trying to do?
This ring would be, yes. Yeah,
Okay.
now Galadriel and Gandalf's power we can argue or not. But yeah,
Yeah.
Sauron. Yep.
Yeah. That good old Tolkien, the Lord of
Yep.
the Rings reference.
Yep.
Like it already. So thank you, Jill Graham, for joining us on our discussion about evil.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I am, like I said, I'm a history enthusiast.
Mm-hmm.
So I have some philosophy background and I have studied the problem of evil somewhat.
Mm-hmm.
But I know that you guys, through Ratio Christi, have probably done multiple talks on the problem of evil. So that's why we're having this discussion.
Okay,
So,
great.
and as you know, I don't know if you know this, but this podcast, this YouTube is geared towards high school, late high school, early college,
Okay.
um, going towards preparing them for kind of the things they're going to encounter, as you probably do with Ratio Christi,
Great.
like things
Great.
they'll encounter in college.
Yeah, that's great.
And so we're going to talk about the problem of evil.
Okay,
So
sounds good.
let's just dig right in. And can you or Matt explain what is the problem of evil? Like, can you encapsulate like the best argument that people who adhere to the problem of evil use against like God and that sort of
Sure.
thing?
Matt, do you want me to?
Go for it.
Okay. I had some suffering in my life at various times. It's been pretty excruciating, and it kind of pushed me to go beyond the pat answers and really look in, okay, what does the Bible say about the problem of evil? What does the literature say about the problem of evil? And I'm going to be drawing from a couple books, so I just want to kind of plug these before I start. One is C.S. Lewis as philosopher. It's really good, and it has a whole bunch of things in it, but there's a really good article in here by a guy named Michael Peterson, who's really awesome. I'll get to that. And he has a whole anthology he does too, and kind of the awesome book is called Wandering in Darkness by Eleanor Stump. And for any of your people who are watching, that is a tough book, but it's well worth the read to get through it. Although if you want to just get started, probably the clearest is there's an article in here where by Michael Peterson called The Necessity of Gratuitous Evil. And I'm going to be referencing that a lot. And so here's
Okay.
kind of what he says, and just kind of like your basic problem of evil is basically if God is all good, if he's a perfectly good God, and he's all knowing, he knows everything that's going on in the universe, and he's all powerful, and he can do anything he wants, he can stop an evil, but evil exists. It seems like there's a problem with that. It seems like where is the disconnect between God being all good, and a good being would want to get rid of evil, and an omniscient being, all knowing, would know that it's there, and an all powerful God would be able to get rid of evil. Yet evil is here, okay? And for most people, they're not sitting there doing a syllogism, but they're just like, hey, something in my life really, really stinks, and it's really hard, and like I thought God is good, and I thought He loves me, and why is this happening? And so that can be that crisis of faith there. So you can approach it kind of from a personal level. And then you also have atheists like J.L. Mackie saying, hey, there's a logical contradiction to all these things. And there's some further forms too. There's just kind of, that's just kind of the basic, it's called the deductive problem of evil. There's an inductive that said, okay, maybe there might be some reason that God might allow evil in a as a perfectly good God, and that strictly deductive logical form was actually taken down by by Alvin Plantinga, okay, in the 60s or 70s. Okay, he goes in and says, look, there could be a reason that we don't know of that God allows it, and that makes it kind of work. Okay, and he said a possible thing. He's not even saying this is it, but it could be that for the good of free will, a world containing creatures who are significantly free, necessitates that there must be some evil that is at least possible, and that could be God's reason. Okay, so he kind of took it down, and he argued in a very philosophically tight way that this is not a problem anymore. Okay, so the next thing that happens is you have what's called the inductive or evidential problem of evil. What about kind of evidential, or what's called the inductive problem, where it just doesn't seem as plausible given the amount of evil and the gratuitous, and by gratuitous he means something that doesn't have a greater good that seems to outweigh it, or it's not avoiding a greater evil. It just doesn't seem probable that such a God would exist. So that's kind of his deal. And he's like, look, if God is really omniscient and wholly good, he would prevent any intense suffering that he could, unless to do so would thereby lose some greater good or permit some evil equally bad or worse. But he says there exist instances of intense suffering which an omnipotent, omniscient being could have prevented without thereby losing some greater good or permitting some evil equally bad or worse. In other words, there are evils that don't seem to have a greater good attached to them. Therefore, an omnipotent, omniscient, wholly good being, God, doesn't exist. And he's just dealing with what's called kind of like a bare theism or a mere theism, not necessarily Christianity, but just a God who is good, all good, all knowing, and all powerful. And he says that it doesn't, even if it might not be logically impossible, it doesn't seem like there's enough evidence from life to really justify that. It seems like the evil, the amount of evil that we see that doesn't seem justified outweighs this belief in a God. So
that's a lot. Yeah, that's a lot to unpack.
Yes.
I tell you.
Yeah, this is hard.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I think it experientially, you got all these arguments for the cause and effect, argument with the universe coming to existence and what caused the cause, and there's a prime cause and a primary mover, and all these things about the Big Bang, and those are arguments for and against the existence of God. And string theory was devised to sort of like give us all multiple universes to sort of address why something came from nothing. But I think where people live, people are not they experience suffering, and everybody, it's universal across the board that suffering exists in our lives. And so it is a natural question to ask why, or to be mad and feel like, why am I suffering? And, where's God in my suffering?
Right.
And you said C.S. Lewis, he I think he wrote like two books, right, about suffering. One he wrote, I think about suffering, right? And then,
there's the problem of pain, where it's kind of the philosophical kind of, and then he suffered with the loss of his wife Joy, and then he's like the grief observed, where he's like suffering, and that is you have to differentiate. There's kind of these logical problems of evil, and then there's that kind of experienced problem of where is God? Does he love me? And there's kind of different ways, like knowing this, kind of understanding some of the logical problems of evil, or their inductive problem, can help you not misunderstand God over here in your experience. In fact, there's a thing that we use a lot. It's just kind of funny. I was like, well, there's this woman who's calling my husband a lot. She calls him all the time. She even calls him on his birthday. She calls him around Christmas. She like sends him presents and stuff. And I've seen some notes. Her name's Virginia. And I could be like, Matt, what's up with this? Who is this girl this lady that's calling you all the time? I'm like, should I be worried? Okay. Until you find out that Virginia is his like 92-year-old grandmother. Okay. So that little extra piece of information can switch the whole frame. So I think a lot of people either are kind of on their own to deal with this, and they haven't heard a lot of good teaching in church. And it's even worse out in society, where everybody is questioning God and saying, oh yeah, you suffer, then God's not good. So they don't have a way to deal with it, really. So all they're saying is, some woman is calling my husband, and they don't see like the truths that God has given us, both through good philosophers and good theology through the Bible, and people like eleonore Stump and C.S. Lewis and all these guys. I mean, David Baggett writes a lot on it too. Michael Peterson. Some people that can really help us reframe and see the problem, so that we see, hey, God is still good. He does still care, and my suffering does not negate either that he's real or that he's good and he loves me, because it kind of challenges those two questions. One, does God even exist? And that's where the atheists and agnostics kind of attack it. And then, even if you do believe God exists, is he good? Does he care about me? That's where it kind of hits home. And so understanding some of how you understand the problem of evil and understand some of the Christian answers to it. And honestly, there's bad answers out there too. So you got to wade through the bad answers to get to the good answers, and that can help reframe it in your mind, so that your heart doesn't take it as God doesn't love me, God isn't good, God isn't real. That's where your head can help your heart.
Yeah, those are really good points. I mean, what I want to do too is talk about, like, just kind of break some things down a little bit for people
Sure.
that may not be familiar with,
Sure.
like the two types of evil that we experience is moral evil, and then there's like natural evil.
Right.
So can we explain to people what is the difference between a moral evil
Yeah.
and what is a natural evil?
Yeah.
That's
So
fine.
yeah, so moral evil is when good agents choose to go bad. So Satan falling and becoming evil. Adam and Eve falling, becoming evil. Us, even though God created us good, and even though we have a fallen nature that makes it harder, when we choose to do wrong things that we know are wrong, that's moral evil. Okay, and sometimes they can be really awful things, like the Holocaust. Sometimes it's as little as like a little white lie or something, but they're all moral evil. Where natural evil is evil that's nobody's fault. It's no free agent is doing it. It's something in the natural world, like a hurricane or a tornado, or Michael Rowe has an example. He uses the example of a little fawn dying in the woods in a forest fire, and it's not the fawn's fault. You know, why would God let a natural evil like that happen? That doesn't seem like that's for some greater good. So that would be your natural evil. Or why do all these people, die in a hurricane or die in a flood or whatever?
And also say too, like, we live in the United States. It's like one of the, it is the wealthiest country in the world, and it's random that we were born in this country. But there are some countries in the world where people are born that are horrible.
Yes.
I mean, some of that could be attributed to moral evil, because people that run those countries are not taking care of them the way they need to, and so
Right.
people are suffering because of that, even though they're like starving, and even too, like, I would say there's some sorry
Yeah.
I even say too that there's some mingling of moral and natural evil. So, like, say for example, someone goes to a forest in South America and cuts it down, right?
Right.
And it caused all this mud, and then there's rain that comes, because it's always raining there, and it causes a huge avalanche.
Right.
And that rain then basically has caused like a whole village to be destroyed, or road to be, so
Right.
there's some mixing of moral and natural agents too.
Right.
And I would say, like, what would you say, like cancer and disease and that sort of thing? Do you think that's part of, I guess, the fallen nature, or is that accounted as natural, or is that a moral thing, or?
Yeah, it's actually interesting, like, because C.S. Lewis gives an answer that's interesting. He said part of it, like, just say like hurricanes and forest fires and that kind of thing. He's like, look, for us to be moral agents and be able to act in the world, God has to make a stable nature. And if every time we tried to do something bad, he like changed nature, so we like couldn't hit somebody or whatever, like, we wouldn't be really free to actually do something that had any significant effect. And you have to have a stable nature to even uphold our action. Like if gravity didn't work, I would just fly off. Or if my hand couldn't really punch Matt in the face, it wouldn't really do anything. So there's part of just having a physical world, so that can create some possibility for natural evil to exist. But I think an interesting answer too, and a very, very true answer from the Bible, is that God created, even nature was good when he created it. And it didn't fall until we fell. So in a way, like you're saying, they can kind of mix. Natural evil can be a kind of a downstream effect of Adam and Eve choosing to sin, or us choosing to sin. So, so later, Paul talks about that all of nature groans in its, in decay, in its bondage to decay. It longs to be set free when we will be set free. So the lion will lay down with the lamb and all that kind of thing. So God has it in mind to redeem it. But in the present, we see it fallen, okay, and messed up. And so a lot of these, like things like cancer, things like this, that would have never happened in God's original good world. But when we fell, nature got off kilter too. And you have animals all of a sudden eating each other. You have things like diseases building up in the gene pool, and then we can make it worse by polluting the environment, so the air we breathe isn't good, and we choose to smoke, and so we get lung cancer. So they're really, natural evil does trace back to moral evil in the beginning, both with Adam and Eve and even us today. You can at least trace some back, and then the residual that's just kind of left is just we have a fixed nature that we all interact in, and there's going to be forest fires that kill a deer, and it's not like God intended that fire to kill that deer. It's just living in a nature like that. And Lewis says maybe in an unfallen world God would jump in and prevent all those things, but there's actually what's his name, Dembski, William Dembski has an interesting argument where he said perhaps God allowed nature to fall to kind of jolt us back into the reality of what we have done. In other words, to show us the effects of sin. So when we had, like back in the Old Testament, when they had to sacrifice a lamb, they saw, holy cow, something had to die for my sin. Or they see that nature is messed up. They kind of see, this is what my sin has done to the world. Or in some other ways, let's say you do suffer with cancer or whatever, it kind of wakes you up to what's really important in life. Is there a God? Am I right with him? That kind of thing. So God can use natural evil as kind of a mirror to us to show us our sinful nature and to show us something is wrong and something needs to be fixed. So it's kind of an interesting argument there.
Well, I want to make a couple of observations about what we said, and one of them is, I see like in our current culture, there's this whole idea of like environmentalism, where there's global warming, and then there's seas are rising, and then there's hurricanes, and they're even more powerful than they were before because of people. So there is even in the broader secular culture this idea that human beings are affecting the environment and causing suffering.
Right.
So it's kind of interesting that, this is kind of part of the problem of evil and natural evil, and how moral evil and natural evil are kind of mixing together.
Right.
But they kind of take off all the theological trappings of it and make it more about, recycling and carbon footprints and
right
and all those things. So, and then they become sins. I mean, in our current culture, not recycling and flying in airplanes and driving cars that aren't electric are sins. And by the way, don't for 1 minute point out that the people that are the proponents of those things fly more and drive more, right. and how much carbon is burned up making a battery for an electric car. Let's not talk about that. But just the normal everyday person that's just trying to get to work, they need to change. Anyway, that's a tangent. But
but it's an interesting one because it betrays that we have a moral nature. So they don't make it just, oh, it's your preference, just, recycle if you want to. They're just like, no, you should. And so this idea that morality is written on our hearts. And sometimes they'll choose one good over another and exalt that. And like, oh, you got to recycle, but it's okay to abort your kid. Okay, that doesn't make sense. But the fact that they have a moral inclination is interesting. And even say, take like vegetarians. So they're big on, how can you eat meat? You meat killers. Okay. What's interesting, you look back in Genesis and God does say, to people and animals, I give you every green plant for food. And it's not till after the fall that, maybe our nutrients or things are different, or maybe it's part of just the fallen world and seeing all the violence of that, whatever. He says, now you can eat meat. So this idea, even in these way out Hollywood people that, oh, you're not supposed to eat meat, that's bad. It actually goes back to an intuition from scripture, which if you told them that would be interesting. But
yeah. Now I'm gonna present you. Man, I keep hitting this mic. I talk with my hands. I'm not Italian, but my wife is.
I do too. My students make fun of me for doing this.
Does Matt need to wear a helmet?
Yeah. I have to stand within a certain radius when you're talking, otherwise.
Yeah.
I have black eyes and.
So let me posit to you. Let me posit to you my thoughts about like the problem of evil and kind of how I have kind of wrapped my head around it through what I've read so far. Okay. And maybe this is some philosopher that I don't know about and I'm just stealing. So maybe that I need to come to terms with that on my own moral certitude about stealing this from somebody else. But the whole idea is that we have a good God who can stop evil. And let's not just say, let's just stop, just any evil, but like the most heinous evil, like think the most heinous thing ever. And God is all good and all powerful. So he can stop that horrible thing. And let's have him just stop that.
Mm-hmm.
Why can't God just stop the most heinous evil thing?
Mm-hmm.
And so my thought, okay, once God say eliminates that, like, so we have a list of like
Mm-hmm.
1,000 horrible things. And
Mm-hmm.
so at the top of number one, we cross it off, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, number two becomes number one, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that now that's the most heinous thing. So we cross that off.
Mm-hmm.
And then we go down and we go down, and the most heinous things is now being removed to
Mm-hmm.
where a point where like a white lie is the most heinous thing
Mm-hmm.
because we've removed everything else.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually I think we don't even have free will, because if God removes what we can do, then we're not free to do what we should do. You know what I'm saying? Does that sound familiar to you, or have you heard that before?
No, I haven't heard that one before. And by the way, I just have to say I'm not omniscient about the problem of evil. I don't know everything. Okay, so I haven't heard that one per se. I don't know. So did you come up with that through thinking it, or...
I don't know where maybe I heard it somewhere, but I may be kind of formulated from different things I've heard.
Uh-huh.
But I just sort of felt like, we're talking about, like, say, it's especially for like moral evil or things we choose to do. I think that if God is a good God, like you said, that all what that means, and he's
Mm-hmm.
all powerful, that means he can limit our freedom, right? And so
Yes.
at what point does limiting our freedom make us robots, and there's no moral choice anymore, that we
Right.
can't make any moral choices?
Right, and that's kind of what, and I'm trying to find it on slides here. I'm gonna have to just kind of do it from memory. But Lewis says, look, if God intervened all the time, then nature was constantly underpropped by God being like, nope, you can't do that. Nope, you can't do that. Nope, you can't do that. Then we couldn't have anything called like a significant moral freedom. And what
Yeah.
Lewis says, and this is really cool how he does this. Okay, he said, look, the reason God made us was to be in relationship with Him, and thus the greatest good is to be rightly related to God. Okay, but again, like if I put a gun to Matt's head and say, "Marry me, please," okay, that's not a real love. Okay, there has to be a freedom there. You didn't smile. Okay, just kidding. Um, okay, there's a yeah. So, or when he asked me to marry him, he didn't put a gun to my head and say, marry me. He let me choose. And there's something about
Yeah.
being in a relationship where you freely choose that is much greater than being forced, or even like, say I was a robot. He made a robot girl. Okay. Maybe some days that would be easier because I wouldn't argue with them. Right. But it wouldn't have that great good of a
Yeah.
real relationship between two people.
Yeah.
So here's what I'm going to quote this, if that's right. This is from Lewis. He says, why then, and to have that, you have to have free will. You have to have that free choice. He says, why then did God give them free will? Because free will, though it makes evil possible, is also the only thing that makes possible any love or goodness or joy worth having. The happiness which God designs for his higher creatures, like us, is the happiness of being freely, voluntarily united to him and each other in an ecstasy of love and delight, and for this they must be free. So he's like, look, it's the greatest good is relational, okay, and the greatest good of all is to be united with God, but God even wants that to be free. And so, but in making a free creature, okay, it doesn't necessitate evil. It doesn't mean evil has to happen. Adam and Eve could not have sinned. We could not sin, at least as much as we do. Okay, maybe we inherit a fallen nature, but we don't have to sin as much as we do. Okay, in heaven there won't be sin, but it's possible that a free creature do something bad. And so Lewis is like, maybe you can imagine a world in which a free being couldn't choose evil, but he said, I can't. Maybe they wouldn't, but not that they couldn't, because if they couldn't, they're not really free. And again, if he stops every evil thing before we do it, bad choice, and only lets us do our good choices, we're not really free. You're only free if you can really choose. It's called libertarian free will, between two options, and nobody is making you do it. We are free agents in that sense. God can influence us, other people can influence us, but we make that final choice as moral agents.
As you're talking, I was thinking about a thing that happened with my family this week. Now, you have kids as well. So I just a little background on me. I was not raised in a Christian family. I became a Christian when I was 15. Like, I was nothing. I had no idea. I barely knew what Christmas was about. Like, that
Wow.
was the extent. That was the extent. And it's hard to believe that someone raised in this country would not know about Jesus
Right.
until they're
Right.
like,
Right.
until they're 15. I came to faith through like a tragedy, like evil.
Okay. Right.
Like my parents' divorce, and my
Wow.
dad left my family, and then I had to live with my uncle, and I didn't live with my mom after that point, like since I was 15 years old. that
Right.
relationship's been strained. So, but God came into that and he saved me, and
Right.
he rescued me from that. And so my attachment to God as my father, and and that sort of relationship has been always been intense and strong,
Right.
because I come from evil, like the stuff that happened to me. But there's
Mm-hmm.
scars, and there's horrible things that I
Mm-hmm.
still carry with me that I wished I didn't have.
Right.
Now, with my kids, like,
Mm-hmm.
my biggest fear is, and my biggest question to God is,
Mm-hmm.
because of my experience of evil and having to come to Christ through suffering,
Mm-hmm.
and clinging to him because of that,
Mm-hmm.
what about our kids?
Hmm.
Like, I when I ever tell my testimony to people, they're always like, wow, that's like, they
Mm-hmm.
sometimes people feel like their testimony doesn't matter,
Mm-hmm.
because they didn't have this like traumatic experience.
Mm-hmm.
But I tell them, I said, you know what, I would not wish my testimony on anybody.
Right.
I said, I wish and I pray for my kids that they come to Christ through my faithfulness,
Yeah.
not my unfaithfulness. But I don't know how that's going to happen, because I haven't allowed much suffering in their life. Like, there's not been those moments where they grow through adversity. And so
Right.
my question for you is, how do we raise morally uh, shape people
Right.
when we hand them everything and they don't have to struggle for anything?
Well, there is, and there's a couple of things I think you got to parse out there. Yeah, we don't want to raise snowflakes. We don't want to raise kids that haven't ever had to struggle for anything, because then that can. I think Matt and I have talked about this before. We kind of live in a cupcake culture where we're not used to a lot of suffering. So all of a sudden, when something does happen, someone gets cancer, or the wrong person gets in political office, or you have to pay taxes, or whatever, or you have to work hard for your job.
No,
All
taxes is a
those,
great evil.
you use all my hot button topics. You just hit them one after another.
So when that happens, they like fall apart, or someone disagrees with them. Okay, they fall apart. Yeah. So we need to let them experience, responsibility, at home. Like, don't do stuff for them. Make sure they do their own homework. Make sure they do chores. Make sure they encounter people that will challenge their ideas and teach them how to deal with that. And teach them that the Bible doesn't promise that we'll never have problems. And I think that's the problem with the American church, is we think God loves me means I'll never have problems. Okay, where the church around the world is like, dude, we have suffering all the time. What are you talking about? Okay, and I love Gary Habermas. When I was really struggling with a miscarriage, is when I really, with our first child, I really struggled intensely with this, and I was just like, God, what is going on? And I think, again, it was kind of a cupcake thing. I had suffering before, but that was a real intense kind, and I just thought, God just miracles stuff away. If you love God, doesn't he just do good stuff for you, and he protects you and he keeps you from bad stuff? Where Jesus says, in this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world. He doesn't promise you that you won't have suffering. He promises he'll be with you through it. And I read Dr. Gary Habermas, who, again, he's a professor at Liberty. Is he down at
Liberty.
Houston Baptist? Is still Liberty? Okay. But he was an adjunct professor at SES, where we went, Southern Evangelical. And he said, look, the Bible doesn't, you look at the Bible and think it's a whole bunch of miracles and see all these miracles. And so if miracles don't happen in your life, you're like, where's God? And he said he went through a hard time when he lost his wife. I think she had cancer very early in his marriage. He had young kids and all this. He's like, God, what's going on? And he went through scripture and he's like, you know what? You can probably count on one hand, like in the New Testament, how many times people got out of suffering versus having to go through it. He says 99% of the time, people had to go through it. Even Jesus went through it. And the miracles are very rare. And we don't know why God does that sometimes and not others. But for the most part, he lets people go through suffering. But the promise is, I will be with you through it, not I will always take you from it. And so I think switching that in the church's mind will help a lot. That's the thing, like, oh, my husband isn't cheating on me because that's his grandma. Oh, suffering doesn't mean God doesn't love me. It means he'll be with me through it. And probably the coolest thing I've read is recently too, and I just was refreshing my mind with this stuff, is Lewis saying, look, the whole point of God, again, is to have free creatures be relationally connected with him. And even if Adam and Eve had never fallen, he would have accomplished that. It just wouldn't have taken suffering. But given we live in a fallen world, given we're suffering, there's what comes into play is called the soul-making theodicy, where he has to let us go through some suffering, because that's what kind of wakes us up. That's what gets us to see our need for God. I mean, he does it all through the Bible with the Israelites. When they're doing great, they used to go away from God. So he's got to bring some suffering. They're like, oh, okay, God, we're coming back to you. And then they go back again. So I think allowing kids to encounter some of the evil of the world and suffering and talking them through it and helping them understand the correct theology, I think that is good. However, there's a flip side to that. And there's this other quote that I love from C.S. Lewis, and this really kind of saved the way I think about the problem of evil and God. And it's going to answer your question too. I promise I'm coming back to it. I'm really long-winded. Sorry, I'm monologue. There's just a lot in my brain. But C.S. Lewis, in a book called Perelandria, which I'm sure you're probably familiar with, his science fiction, he has this Venus. He has these other planets are all populated with people that are unfallen. And on Venus, there's like an Adam and Eve that haven't fallen. But there's this kind of like demon-possessed guy who goes on a rocket and is trying to basically corrupt the Eve figure. And then there's this guy named Ransom who, the God figure of this, kind of brings there to protect that Adam and Eve. And the demonic figure is basically telling Eve, hey, look, you need to sin and disobey God, because when Adam and Eve did that on our world, God brought great good out of it. He brought the incarnation, and he brought Jesus dying on the cross. And if they hadn't sinned, they wouldn't have really had all this knowledge, and they wouldn't have had this great redemption. So see, you should disobey God. And then Ransom has to jump in there. And this is what he says. It's awesome. He says, whatever you do, he will make good of it, God. But not the good he had prepared for you if you had obeyed him. That is lost forever. The first king and the first mother of our world did the forbidden thing, and he brought good of it in the end. But what they did was not good, and what they lost we have not seen. And there were some to whom no good ever came, nor ever will come. In other words, and this is where you have to be really careful as a Christian explaining the problem of evil and saying everything is happening for this great good. See, God has a good reason for it. If you're talking to someone who's really suffering, they're going to be like, forget your God. He did this to me to like teach me and grow my character. He allowed me to be raped, or my baby sister to be raped and killed and murdered. Really? Just to grow my prayer life? All right, so you have to be really careful. Like, there's real loss. And so when you grow up, like in a home like you grew up in, and there are things, like you said, you'll never get out of your brain. Okay, those things are really evil, and they needn't have happened. They shouldn't have happened. Like, sin is never, God never causes sin to bring a good. That's a perversion of thinking about God. Okay, when people sin, there's really suffering for them, for themselves. It breaks God's heart. You have things that will last with you for the rest of your life. I deal with some of that on my own, some things from my past that were done to me that I still suffer with today. And I don't think God inflicted that on me to teach me something. Okay? So you have to be really careful how you say it. I think that happens because God has made us free creatures, and we live in a world of significant moral freedom where we can really mess up. We can really hurt ourselves and others. And we live in a world that's really fallen. Okay? But God can do what he did in your story, even though it would have been better if you grew up in a Christian home and had a good model of who a father figure was. Like, I looked at my husband. He's a great model to our kids, where I had two father figures who were not a good model. Okay? And even though God used that in my life and used that in your life, he's redeeming it. He's using it for a good. It's not that the thing itself was good. You see the difference? And this hit me when my husband and I visited where the Twin Towers were after September 11th, and they have this huge, beautiful, the Freedom Tower Memorial, and then they have all the names etched in this, this little waterfall area. And I looked at it and I said, do you think God allowed 9/11 to happen so we could build this beautiful building? That just would be preposterous. Like, what? What are you talking about? Like, so there's a difference between why God allowed 9/11 in the first place, which I have no idea. I'm not God. Why that interaction between free will and is there punishment in our nation? I have no idea. But what happens a lot is we see how God creatively redeems it, how through people he works to try to build this great tower, right? And to redeem an evil. That is not the reason he allowed it to happen in the first place. And sometimes when we say that to people, that can sound very like, what in the world are you talking about? How is God good? Yeah. So for you, so I think you can, by having a good model of a father, you can actually help protect them against falling for the problem of evil, because Matt has never really struggled with it. He had a really good father figure. I, on the other hand, have suffered, like, this has been a struggle significant, and I had two father figures that I couldn't trust. And so I think that does impact your view of God. So all that to say, I know that's a lot packed into an answer to a question, but I think raising your kids with a good Christian home and a good model does help, but you have to expose them to some some struggle at the same time. And that was a really long answer. I'm sorry.
And I think they're gonna find their own struggles too. I mean,
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
they're gonna fall, and that's gonna be heartbreaking as a parent to have to see that. But you also have to know too that and that's what you're getting to, is that God doesn't use like evil as a he can use evil as a tool, but not directly. Like
Right.
he can bring good out of evil, like in the story of Joseph,
Right.
with his brothers. Like, he
Right.
said, what you intended for evil, God did for good. Save the Israelites for the famine that was coming.
Right.
And so and that's what I want to turn to. As we wrap up. I know it's coming on to an hour, but
Yeah.
I wanted to talk about the most heinous, I think, definition of what evil happened on earth ever was the death of an innocent man that was also divine, which is the crucifixion.
Right.
That was if we look at the problem of evil, how do how does the cross fit in? And also I want to talk too, because we both love Tolkien, and the idea of the eucatastrophe,
Yeah.
and how the crucifixion is is the eucatastrophe.
Right.
It's a great horrible evil, and then that's also wrapped up in your salvation.
Right.
So could we talk about like how the cross and Jesus fits in, and how eucatastrophe
Sure.
fits in with this whole issue?
Yeah, I love that question. And let me kind of piggyback it on the Joseph question that you brought up, because that's one that's used a lot, and be like, see, God wanted his brothers to almost kill him and sell him into slavery. And I really struggled with that verse for a while too. And I had to look at it. And what one pastor theologian I was looking, he said in the Hebrew, that word, because a lot of people translate it, well, you meant it for evil, God meant it for good. And it makes it sound like, well, God meant for that to happen. Well, the word in the Hebrew, I guess, means rewove. So you take something and you reweave it into something good. Very different. And there's a thing
That's a good analogy. That's a good.
Yeah, and this was what helped me. I actually cried. I broke down when I read this in Eleanor Stump, where she talked about the difference between what's called antecedent will and a consequent will. Okay, and we'll get to your question. This is part of with Jesus too. So the antecedent will is what God wills before taking into account the free wills of creatures. So he creates a good world that is supposed to be perfectly good, where Jesus never even had to die. I mean, in a perfect world, if Adam and Eve had not fallen, what Lewis says is that God's point of drawing us into himself, he could have done without the cross. He could have done it. He could have still had Jesus incarnated to show us who he was. He still could have drawn us that way without any pain or suffering, without Jesus even having to die. But consequent will is what God wills or allows as a consequence of the free will of creatures. So it allows for sin, but it's not necessary. So I was like, could God not have gotten Joseph to Egypt in another way? Could he not have sent him a dream or something? Sure. Okay, now given what his brothers do, which is evil, okay, God allows that because they're free creatures, but he's not telling them to do that. He could have done it another way, and maybe there was a loss there. I mean, he had to grow up without his father, and his father mourned him for years. There's real loss because they did it that way. But God is so big that he can even he's not thwarted by our evil. Okay, he can go above it and create something good. He can wrench a great good out of a great evil, which Dorothy Sayers says he does with the cross. So even with Jesus, that is not God's antecedent will. That's not what he willed before men fell. But given that men fell, he knew he would have to do something to bring us back. And so he sees Jesus in that first act when Adam and Eve sinned. And that's why he even says, your seed will overcome the serpent. He will strike your heel, you will crush his head. So he sees the cross in that, but that's his consequent will. That's what he wills, given knowing what free creatures are going to do. Not that he had to do that from an eternity past, which is interesting. So there's both a great loss in Jesus dying and suffering and having to do that and having to be, and however that works, being separated from God's presence. How you do that when you are part God, that's a mystery. But he suffers not only a physical death, but the spiritual death of separation from God. But out of that, Satan thinks he won. He's like, woohoo, we won. And then God says, nope, judo move. And he pulls a great good out of a great evil, and he saves humanity. Okay? But that overcoming evil with good does not mean that the original evil was okay. It didn't mean that, and this is what Lewis really struggled with. He said in I think it's a Westminster thing, he's like, oh, happy fault of Adam. They actually call it happy that, oh, Adam and Eve fell so we could have Jesus. And he's like, that just sounds horrendous. There's something really wrong with that. And that's where he says, no, that's God. It could have been done better. And nobody would have been lost to hell. if we hadn't fallen. So there's some to whom no good will ever come. Those people who are lost to hell and the Satan and his angels that fell, that's a real loss forever for the universe. That didn't have to happen. But God is so good, he can do the eucatastrophe. Catastrophe means an awful thing happens. You is the good form. It turns it for good. So everything is going evil. This is what Tolkien does. And he says, and then there's this turn. And there's this ending that brings about happiness. So when Jesus dies on the cross, he breaks the power of sin and the power of the devil over us, and he sets us free. And it's the eucatastrophe that will be fully consummated when he comes back. And he destroys all evil, and good wins. It's like flip to the end, and we win of the Bible, right? So that's why Lewis and Tolkien are both big on the great stories have happy endings, because they reflect the real story, God's story, where we have a happy ending. And all these like people trying to have like the dark heroes and the tragic ending and all this, they're trying to be all trendy or whatever. But like it's like the third Matrix. Nobody really likes those movies, right? It just ends in kind of this ambivalence. The movies that we really gravitate to, Lord of the Rings, even Star Wars, good triumphs over evil. And that's what will happen at the end of time. That's what happened at the cross. But again, the big picture is none of the evil had to happen. Made possible by free creatures, but never had to happen. And even though God can redeem and bring good out of evil, it doesn't mean that original evil is okay or that it's good. And I had a friend who, she lost her son to cancer actually when he was 4. And she looked at me and she said, Jill, all these people have come up to me and said, oh, God works all things for good for those who love him. And she's like, I just wanted to punch these people in the face. Because when you say that to somebody who's suffering and out of context, it's like, what are you talking about? And so we had to talk through, hey, what happened with her son is not good. It is a result of a fallen world, of Adam and Eve falling, of us falling, of everything, messing up nature. That is a thing to be grieved. It is a bad, horrible thing. God grieves. Like God, Jesus grieved at Lazarus' tomb. He cried. He wept, even though knowing he was going to raise him 5 minutes later. He wept because evil is a great thing, and it's a great evil, and it's a great like suffering is real. And if we Pollyanna that away as Christians, people won't take us seriously, and they see God as a moral monster. But if we say this is really evil, but God is so big, he can overcome it. He can bring a eucatastrophe out of it. He can use now what's happened in my friend Wanda's life, and she's been this great witness to people. He can redeem it. But that doesn't mean the thing that happened was good. And I think that's the biggest misunderstanding with the problem of evil, is mistaking, and this is what Michael Peterson said, mistaking creative ways God redeems it for why he allowed it in the first place, and thinking that you don't need to grieve evil. Sorry.
So that's kind of summarizes. If you can summarize in just like one, or maybe one statement about what is the solution to the problem of evil? Because then we talked about a lot of different ins and outs of what evil and moral and philosophical, and what God can do out of horrible things, and kind of God can reweave, which I love that point that God can reweave the tapestry of our life to good, even if we do evil. So how would you put it in a nutshell, like someone who has issues with evil and like the evil in the world, how would you answer them? I know we talked about a lot, but like just in a real quick like nugget of some summation.
Yeah, evil is a real thing that breaks the heart of God. God weeps over it. We should too. That being said, and that comes because of free creatures misusing their free will, and that affects people, that affects nature, affects everything. But God is so big, he can redeem it, and he doesn't leave us stuck there. He gives us hope in that. He gives us a way out. He gives us a way to redeem it. He creates a way to destroy the evil in us and make us good and bring us into that life and that fellowship with him. So God can redeem even the greatest evil. But even that, and Lewis talks about this too, depends on how you let him use it in your life. It's another cooperating with God. You can let it make you bitter and let it make you hate God and say there's no good reason that God could have allowed this, or there's no way that God can turn this for good in my life. You can be bitter, and it can really destroy you if you let it. But if you let him, he can redeem it and use it for a great good in your life. And you can overcome evil with good. You don't have to be overcome by it. But again, that free choice is huge, and why it happened, and also how much you allow God to redeem that thing in your life.
Yeah, I totally agree. Like just for example, like my family, there are people that had the same upbringing as me, but they didn't choose to follow Christ, and their lives have been a continuation of the misery and the suffering and the
Yes.
sin
Yeah.
that I was exposed to when I was a kid, and it's sad, and it's like
Yeah.
it's amazing when I look, and I see someone who's 50 something years old and they look like they're 80,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
because of the suffering, and then at the point in time, how can you help somebody who also doesn't want to help themselves, with family members and stuff. So
It is
it's a
hard.
real like solid, boots on the ground issue.
Yeah.
And I think that's why we wanted to talk about it too, because it was,
Yeah.
because people are experiencing suffering and they are
Yeah.
experiencing
Especially
evil.
now. Yeah.
Yeah, and also with our culture as well. Like, Matt and I have, in our couple of episodes, in the past, have talked about how, there's no tolerance anymore for differing views, and we make people our enemies and we make them evil, and
Mm-hmm.
and it's getting to a point where it's becoming more of a like, I think, of a breaking point,
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah, and even
but
God, like for God to say he desires that none should perish. But in the end, like Lewis says, God says to them, there's two kinds of people, and I'm sure you're familiar with this. There's two kinds of people in the end. Those who say to God, thy will be done, and surrender in him, or to God, those to whom God says, I've tried and tried and tried and tried, and you won't listen. Your will be done. And hell is self-chosen. It is that where you have chosen to hold on to your evil, to push God away and not let him heal you. And that is the saddest thing of all. And that's what I mean. There's real suffering and real loss, even in the heart of God, to lose anyone to hell. And yet he has to let it happen. Just like you can't make someone freely be good. And that's so hard. Like as a parent, when you want to reach in and fix them, and you can't. You can influence them, but you can't make them. Even God doesn't do that. Because imagine if he could. Then we would be mad at him. Hey, he zaps me against my will. I don't love this God. But because
or we'd all be Calvinists.
right, exactly. I don't know. My husband talked you out of that. I heard that.
Well,
he
that
helped
was-
on the journey.
yeah.
He helped on the journey.
That was one of the things that kind of hit me, because I was actually, like, I'd gone through a relationship when I met Matt, and it was a 2-year-long relationship, and like, she liked me, and I think she loved me, but at a point, and she was like 6 years older than me and was at a different maturity level than me, and she just saw the writing on the wall, like, this guy's not going to get there in the time I need him to get there. And no matter how much I pleaded, no matter how much I tried to convince her, no, I'm the guy, like, I could not change her will. Like, I could not make her love me.
Right.
And so I thought, if I can't make somebody, I mean, I know God can do it, if God chose, but like, and also, if I made her, if I wished her from some genie, like,
Right.
is it really love?
Right.
Like, there needs to be this real sense of, like, this person really wants to love me because it's a free outpouring of their desire,
Right.
not because they're trying to satisfy my desire for them to want me, so that's what convinced me about Calvinism is, like, there's a term that is used for forced love, and I don't think God does that.
No, he's
to
a
people.
gentleman. Yep. And yeah, he desires that none should perish. That's my key verse with that. Yet people do. And if he could, I would be a Calvinist if everyone was in heaven, but they're not, because that free will is such a key thing. And even I've been explaining this to our kids. It's homeschooling. My 7-year-old gets that. She's like, you got to be free, Wesley. She's saying that to him the other day. Satan chose to be bad. Like, she's explaining that to him. Like even a child can grasp that, because it's such a key part of how God has created the world and created us. And again, it's the greater the thing's possibility for good, the worse it is where it falls. So all the evil in the world is because of a fallen goodness, a free will that is fallen. But a free will that is good is the best thing in the world. That's heaven. And and heaven is where people are freely choosing to surrender to and love God. And because of that, they can freely love each other. And so you have that communion, where hell is everyone is closed off to God and each other. And it's this, Stump calls it permanent willed loneliness. And that sometimes God, in a redemptive way, uses evil to shock us out of our permanent willed loneliness, where we're on the road to hell. We're on the road to shutting him and others out, and uses it to open us up to the good. But had we not fallen, he wouldn't have to do that. So even that is a redemptive will. It's that consequent will. So it all intertwines. Yeah.
Wow. Well, that was a lot.
Yeah. This is a lot of PowerPoints, and when I give this talk, it's like 3 talks in one, really, because you can't be like, problem of evil in 5 minutes. Here you go. It's too complex for that.
Jill, thank you so much for being part of this.
You're welcome. No, it's really fun. Thanks.
Matt, thanks a lot for sitting there.
Just
Through the illustration, I tried to bring
Well,
you in.
Thanks, hey Jill. Thanks for bringing your prop, Matt.